Climate change, pollution, world hunger, as well as inequality in and between countries remain key challenges. To address these, the UN developed 17 sustainability goals that aim to ensure a more just and innovative society, promote sustainable growth, enhance renewable energy use, as well as better protect nature and the environment. The financial industry will play an important part. In the same way it enables economic activity or helps to create jobs, the financial industry will be critical in financing businesses and projects to overcome the challenges we face. When businesses implement environmentally friendly production processes, when houses have to be more energy efficient, when money is needed to fund research into renewable energy, this is done through banks, funds or insurance companies who invest their own as well as their clients' money. There are increasingly more financial products available to private individuals that have a positive impact and support the aims of sustainability goals. From the beginning, Luxembourg has been committed to implementing and facilitating the sustainability goals. Just like our financial centre, which is already receiving worldwide recognition for its commitment and initiatives in this area, sustainable finance will become the standard, and our financial centre will be a key player and partner on a global level in financing a sustainable future.
Welcome to the Sustainable Finance Forum, bringing together key sustainable finance experts from across the world to share their views on how finance can shape a sustainable future.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon and good evening wherever you are in the world. Once again, a warm welcome to the second day of our Sustainable Finance Forum 2021. And if you missed out on our first day, don't worry, because everything will be recorded and the streams of both days will be made available right after our wrap today on the website of Luxembourg for Finance. And a quick reminder, if you happen to tweet about the conference or post anything on LinkedIn, please be sure to add the hashtag SFL21 and the handle @LuxFinance so we can see what you share. Now, yesterday, we took the high-level view on sustainable finance. Where does it stand just a few days before COP26 kicks off in Glasgow? And we indeed launched a study that was a bit of a reality check as far as volumes of sustainable finance go. It is called Benchmarking ESG in Banking and Finance, and you can access it right here on the website of Luxembourg for Finance. I just want to give you three appetizers there. So there has been significant growth in ESG activity, but in most sectors, it's still only a slice of the total. And yes, Europe is way ahead, but the US and Asia are quickly catching up. And indeed, Commissioner McGuinness made clear in her keynote that in order to achieve a reduction of emissions of 55% by 2030 and net zero by 2050, the scale of investment needed is beyond anything the public sector can provide. And so for the private sector, she said, sustainability is not anymore a nice to have, it's a must have. And because this also requires a global collaborative effort, she said the Commission, and I quote, strongly promotes convergence and ambition when it comes to sustainable finance at a global stage. And she also said that this is why the International Sustainable Finance Platform is due to publish a report on a common ground taxonomy that will set out common features in existing taxonomies. And adding to that, Finance Minister Pierre Gramegna said he will actually attend COP26, that he expects for more commitments to come through at this gathering. And just like Commissioner McGuinness, he emphasized the need to prevent greenwashing, for example, but of course that Europe cannot just impose its taxonomy on the rest of the world. The US, for example, prefers a bottom-up approach as opposed to the top-down approach here in Europe. But he's confident that, for example, with the help of the OECD, a compromise can be accomplished, just like it was achieved with the deal on taxation. I can tell you what top of the wish list of our panel on global convergence or fragmentation was, and that is making TCFD standard mandatory for as many countries as possible. And in the panel discussion on the latest sustainable finance investment trends, 3 pretty much stood out. There's an accelerated pace of innovation that is broadening out across all sectors. Due to COVID-19, there's definitely a rise in the S for social in ESG, reflecting a stronger awareness of impact, which as a result has the effect that some investors from the ESG ecosystem are gravitating towards impact investing, which we'll touch upon later in the day with my interview with impact investor Nicolas Adalberth. And as far as regions are concerned, Asia is definitely very attractive for investors, being home to 60% of the global population, with that huge need to invest privately in renewable energy and achieve that path towards climate neutrality. And additionally, the panel highlighted the need to invest in skills and talent to bring in people who are open for a change in mindset, because this is not just about investing sustainably, but about a structural change in the whole financial sector. So through all the contributions today, there was this undercurrent of the 3 C's I mentioned at the outset: collaboration, coordination and capital, that we need to underpin all the commitments to protect the climate and also build back better after the pandemic. And today we add C number 4, as in C for clarity, as we shift the focus from the theoretical to the practical. So what does this alphabet soup, such as taxonomy, CFRD, CSRD, coming out of the EU mean for financial services? And which pieces are still being developed and being fine-tuned or in need of being developed to provide clarity about the actual impact of sustainable investment on the ground? Which takes me straight to our keynote speaker for today, because clarity matters are the first 2 letters she started a letter to the Financial Times with, which was published in September. And in her letter, she highlights the trouble with confusing sustainable finance analysis that fails to provide that clarity, that fails to provide transparency for investors. And she knows quite a great deal about this topic, because as head of MSCI's ESG and Climate Research Group, she oversees all ESG and climate-related content and methodology, which means she leads one of the largest and best researcher teams worldwide, which is dedicated to identifying risks and opportunities pertaining to material ESG issues. So it's my distinct pleasure to welcome to the Sustainable Finance Forum Linda-Eling. Linda, great to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Judith. Before I begin, I want to thank the team at Luxembourg for Finance for convening all of us on the eve of COP26 to discuss how we can catalyze the massive amounts of capital that's required to accelerate the energy transition. And if I may, I also would like to take a minute to just express a special soft spot that I have had for Luxembourg, because Luxembourg was the very first place I ever visited in Europe. Yes, before Paris or Rome or Berlin. I had the opportunity to spend my spring break every year throughout my college years in Luxembourg, and that happened because of the foresight and generosity of the Duchy of Luxembourg, which brought students across Europe together with a group of Harvard University students from the US to learn the importance of collaboration and coordination to pursue our common goals to benefit society. So coming to today, our common goal across the public and private sector is to mitigate the substantial risks from climate change and to put our global economic system on a more sustainable path. Now, even though achieving that common goal will mean different solutions across markets and jurisdictions, I believe that we can only achieve that goal if we speak a common language when we talk about climate risk and we use common building blocks for our varied solutions. And that's what I'd like to talk about today to kick off the series of discussions on the practicalities of managing climate risk. Over a decade now, MSCI has been sitting at a unique intersection between thousands of institutional investors and thousands of companies globally by providing environmental, social, and governance measures that allow investors to see their portfolio companies and compare them using extra financial metrics that can sit alongside their financial measures. And increasingly, we are also sitting at the intersection of what policymakers would like to see when gauging and comparing the resilience of the financial institutions which underpin our economic stability. So from that vantage point, let me start with some basics of where we stand today if nothing changes. So by our estimate, in just 5 years, the world's publicly listed companies will burn through the emissions budget that they have for keeping the Earth's temperature rise to under 1.5 degrees. Currently, we lack a holistic picture of companies' emissions profile, even though emissions from companies' value chain accounts for the vast majority of a company's footprint in many sectors. Fewer than 20% of all companies are disclosing them. And because we can't manage what we don't measure right now, we estimate that about 90% of all companies are projected to overshoot their allocated emissions budget for staying under 1.5 degrees. So that is where we are. It's not a very rosy picture. So how are we going to get to net zero from here? How is it going to be possible to both drastically cut emissions, that every company on average needs to reduce emissions by 10% every single year until 2050? How are we going to do that and at the same time actually allocate trillions to invest in completely retooling our energy infrastructure? Well, at MSCI, we believe that we're about to witness the largest reallocation of capital since the Industrial Revolution. And in order for everyone to be running in the same direction towards that new economy, we need new kinds of measures that we don't have today. Measures that we can use to guide where we might choose to withdraw capital, where we need to engage with companies to make faster progress, and where we could be seeding new investments. In other words, we really need new types of measures so we can incorporate and value climate risk in a systematic way. Right now, the financial industry is in a very innovative and experimental phase when it comes to measuring climate risk. We're quickly developing and testing these new measures because we know that existing measures are not up to the task of helping investors and helping companies to allocate towards a net zero future. Over the next few years, many of you will be seeking out these new measures in your quest to manage your own company, your portfolio, or your financial market or economy towards net zero. And when you do so, I propose that you ask whether the new measures that you're looking at fulfill 3 key criteria. First, is it forward-looking? Second, is it comprehensive? Third, is it dynamic? So let me take each of those criteria in turn. I'm going to illustrate what I mean by being forward-looking, being comprehensive, and being dynamic with a recent innovation called the implied temperature rise metric. But very simply, it is a temperature measure for a company, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3.5 degrees or more, that tells us just how much warmer our Earth will be if every entity on the planet overspends its emissions budget or underspends its emissions budget over the next 30 to 50 years as much as this one company. And earlier this month, the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, published a technical supplement from the portfolio alignment team, which lays out the parameters for how such a measure could be constructed. Constructed along the parameters that are laid out by this portfolio alignment team's report, a company's implied temperature rise metric is first and foremost forward-looking. So today, most of us who are allocating capital towards low carbon investments are evaluating companies based on their carbon emissions. That is a backward-looking measure of what companies did last year. An implied temperature rise projects the entire emissions of a company in the next 30 to 50 years, including its carbon reduction commitments. So when we look at 2 oil and gas companies with similar businesses, we could take Shell, we could take Exxon, for example, they can look quite similar when we take today's snapshot of their emissions. But what we care about is the future trajectory of these companies, which may in fact diverge very substantially. So from a similar starting point, we estimate that Shell's trajectory could align them with a world that is 2.1 degrees warmer, if they manage to stick to their stated plans to retool their business over the next 30 years. While Exxon's trajectory would take us to a world that is more than 4 degrees warmer. So these new measures, they need to help us project that future and not mire us in the past. Comprehensive, it's really important that the implied temperature rise metric is comprehensive in what it measures, and any climate risk measure needs to do so. For all industries except for a very small handful, by far the largest portion of companies' emissions is in their value chain, in their scope 3 emissions. So any new measure that you're using has to cover the full emissions footprint, scopes 1, 2, and 3, or we are simply missing large portions of what needs to be managed and mitigated. And then finally, the usefulness of any new climate risk metric will hang on its ability to be dynamic, to incorporate new information, especially information on reduction commitments that are being made by countries and by companies and their progress against those commitments year after year. So the new measures we need for climate risk can hold us jointly accountable for achieving a net zero economy. We enable transparency throughout the entire financial system when everyone shares a common way to measure. We can build our unique strategies to achieve net zero, of course, but using common building blocks will align us in the same direction, and it's going to keep us honest because it will be harder to hide behind excuses like we can't compare progress on an apples-to-apples basis. As I said earlier, the financial industry is in a phase of fast-paced innovation as we develop these common building blocks that are forward-looking, that are comprehensive, and that are dynamic. But we are missing some critical ingredients to improve the rigor and the robustness of these building blocks. And that is where policymakers around the world need to come in. You've heard from many financial regulators, policymakers, and standard setters at this forum who have proposed initiatives to channel capital towards a net zero world. There is a great deal of appetite now to mandate disclosure on climate risk. And some of those approaches are going to work better than others, and some could actually be counterproductive and introduce perverse incentives. Now, while I had set out 3 criteria against which new climate risk metrics should be evaluated, whether it's forward-looking, comprehensive, and dynamic, when it comes to regulating climate risk disclosure, I have only one overarching request, and that is, in considering any rules and regulations around climate risk reporting, I urge regulators and standard setters around the world to prioritize a level playing field throughout the entire market. So what do I mean by that? Well, let me get specific and provide some do's and don'ts for a level playing field. Do require disclosure of the most common core metrics regardless of sector. Those common core metrics should include scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions, plus, critically, the location of a company's biggest facilities. That means don't, as a regulator, take a shortcut, which would be asking for outputs rather than the inputs, such as asset locations, that are the critical ingredients to any climate risk assessment. If you instead ask for the percentage of operations that are vulnerable to climate physical risk, for example, you will end up with output measures that are simply not comparable across your portfolio. Do require disclosures that are comprehensive. And that means don't allow companies to pick and choose what they deem to be material to report, for example, on scope 3 emissions. Level playing field means all companies disclose all categories of scope 3 emissions, not picking and choosing what they feel like reporting, which is sometimes really very little. Today, of the companies that report on scope 3 emissions, which is fewer than 20% of companies, the majority of them, 60%, are actually only reporting the emissions from their business travel, which is not particularly or material for most companies. Do put in place disclosure requirements for the most opaque parts of the market. That means don't let privately held companies play by different rules when it comes to climate risk disclosures. We recently estimated the carbon emissions of 15,000 companies that are held in private equity funds and compared them to the 9,000 in the publicly listed universe. The exposure to climate transition risk is no less among private companies than among public companies, and they could potentially actually be more concentrated. So whereas the top 50 public company emitters accounted for approximately 40% of the carbon emissions of all public companies, the top 50 private company emitters accounted for nearly 2/3 of the emissions of all private companies in this 15,000 company dataset. So as we shine a brighter and brighter light on public listed companies, we risk a migration of climate risk to these darker corners of the investment portfolios. So a level playing field is required between public and private companies that would provide a more holistic picture of where climate risk actually resides in our financial system. So I'd like to end my remarks today by pointing out that today, when we take the collective temperature of all the public companies in the world, it's approximately 9,000 companies in the broadest MSCI index, their emissions trajectory would take our world to being about 3 degrees warmer by the end of the century. So we can choose to despair over that status report, or we can be galvanized by the fact that more and more investors and companies are actually stepping forward every day. We see them adopting a common language of net zero emissions and of temperature alignment, and more they are using new forward-looking metrics as the building blocks that will guide them and that can guide all of us into a more climate resilient future. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to pass that back to you, the studio with you, Judith.
Thank you so much, Linda-Eling Lee there. Thank you for your terrific expertise and this very helpful snapshot of those essential metrics that are needed to help create a level playing field and provide that much needed clarity on the impact of sustainable investments. And as Linda said, we have a common language now on green investments. That's the taxonomy, but certain aspects still need to be fine-tuned. For example, how do we label nuclear energy and natural gas? And so our first panel will address how financial institutions and financial service providers are integrating the taxonomy in its current state and which issues still need ironing out. And I have the great pleasure to introduce a colleague of mine over from the Financial Times as moderator for this panel. He's Matthew Vincent, and he has a life's worth of financial news reporting at the FT under his belt. Currently, he's the editor of the FT Project Publishing, which means he's planning and producing many of the FT's themed reports that you may have seen regarding financial services or technology or energy, among others. And Matthew is joined by our 3 esteemed panel speakers. We have Eila, Kreivi, Director at the European Investment Bank and indeed Head of Capital Markets Department. We have Martijn Oosterwoud, who's Group Sustainability and Impact Director at the UBS Office for Sustainability. And we have Elizabeth Gillam, who's Head of EU Government Relations and Public Policy over at Invesco. So warm welcome to all of you, and over to Matthew.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Judith. It's great to be here for this panel session on the green taxonomy, so long awaited, still yet to be finalized, but so very, very important for investors attempting to address this issue of sustainability in finance and in all that they do. Got a great panel here for you, as you can see. So, without further ado, we've got a very big topic to take on in a relatively short amount of time. Let's start then, if I can come to you, Eila, first of all, with the overall sort of opening question, which is, what is the purpose or what are the purposes, because I'm sure there's much more than one, of the green taxonomy in your view?
Yes, thank you, Matthew, and thank you, everybody in the panel. I think I'm only talking about the EU panel of the EU taxonomy, of course, because that's the one that I know the best. There are many others in the development as well. But I think the taxonomy, it started as a way of just classifying those activities which are green or green enough for us to be carbon neutral by 2050. It has also grown into the basis of a corporate and bank financial institution reporting framework, which are two sort of separate lanes, if you like. And I think the meaning with or the need for the taxonomy was becoming clear, because when this green finance started to become institutional, let's say in 2013-14 or thereabouts, then practically anything that was greener or better than what people, corporates, whomever did before was considered as green. And now, after a few years of the market developing, I think it was recognized that not everything which is a little bit greener than before is green enough for us to be there at the zero carbon society by 2050. And because of that, we need now the definitions. What are the activities and at which level of carbon efficiency or improvements can they be considered to be on that path towards Paris 2050? And this was the need. And then, of course, when these definitions were worked on, this became also a basis for reporting or disclosures that is required then from at least large corporates and from banks and investors. So that's the sort of basic view that I have what this taxonomy is for and why it was necessary to develop it now and not maybe earlier and not later.
Certainly, thank you, Eila. Elizabeth, if I can come to you to get a view from Invesco. Eila talked there about sort of two lanes, twin purposes for the taxonomy. Is that how you see it also?
Yes, I think that there are multiple different ways the industry, particularly asset managers, are thinking about using the taxonomy. Now, clearly, one of them, and drawn from that corporate reporting side of things, is obviously in fundamental analysis. When we're looking at companies, how do we think about those that are best placed to benefit from the transition? Because obviously we know that the climate transition imposes risk, but also opportunities and very significant investment opportunities. We know that trillions will need to be invested in order for us to achieve net zero by 2050. The second one is obviously then from a product perspective, we see a huge amount of appetite from clients to align their investments with the goals of net zero and more broadly environmental goals, and therefore it also can be used as a tool to develop products based around the taxonomy for those who want to really invest in those things that have that sort of kite mark, as you will, of the taxonomy of being, as they were describing, not just better than the status quo, but truly aligned with net zero. And obviously, as Eila mentioned, the regulation then sort of applies a broad brush reporting obligation to help that transparency across the market, so that investors can compare different products and understand where they might fit, and using the taxonomy as that sort of common thread to assess the greenness of an investment.
So it clearly has this practical application for investors and for the communication that you as a product provider will have with investors. Martijn, at UBS, how do you think that the taxonomy will be used in terms of communication with clients, customers?
I think it will be a very important part. Being in sustainability already for a very long time, language is something that we should not underestimate. Communicating to clients in one clear way, and I think the industry as a whole has some issues to solve there, is very important. And that is maybe, if I come to that point directly, one of the issues that I see with the current taxonomy, because it leaves out a lot of shades of green, so to speak. If we look at the current taxonomy and would create products that would qualify as 100% invested in sustainable product. First of all, it's the question if it's possible, because the data currently is not fully there. But second of all, it would create very, very narrow portfolios. And I think that's actually the major step that we've made over the last 3 to 5 years, I would say, that green investing no longer is a niche where we focus on a number of solar and wind companies to add to portfolios, but the greenness of the portfolio really needs to be integrated across all sectors, across all industries. And that's something with the current taxonomy that's relatively difficult, at least in terms of this communication and reporting effort that we're facing at the moment, because clients see a very small portion of green investments as defined by the EU. And what's really lacking is a way to talk about these transition path, about sectors that need to do better, that are already in progress towards aligning towards a low carbon economy, but don't get captured currently. So there's a lot of upside. There's a lot of positive, I think, developments going on, but there are definitely also some challenges that we still need to solve.
Oh, most definitely. Yeah, this is what I certainly hear. And then, let's explore some of those challenges. I mean, I think, Martijn, you mentioned that investors might only see a very sort of small number of investments as sort of being classified as green. Eila, if I can come back to you, why will the numbers seem quite small at first? What are the limitations here?
Well, first of all, one has to keep in mind that this taxonomy, the green taxonomy, is meant to be for the best definition. So as the definitions go, in order to be aligned with that taxonomy, you need to have a significant contribution. So significant is the key word, not just any contribution, but significant. And then you have some other conditions there as well. But so one should not even look for the many shades of green in the taxonomy, because that's not necessarily meant to be. There are some transitional activities defined there, but they are really transitions that go from zero carbon 2050. And that path is quite stringent. I mean, they have made some definitions for industries like cement or steel, but they are very, very hard to achieve. And that's, everybody acknowledges that. But there is also now this platform for sustainable finance, which is working on the definitions, on the usability, working on proposals on social taxonomy. There's also one group who is working on a proposal for another taxonomy for activities of significant harm, colloquially brown, and then also the part that is no significant in contribution. These are a bit long names, but basically means a brown, and then the transition activities from perhaps brown to amber, from amber to green, and then also that big part of the economy, largely services, which is, let's say, white, because it doesn't have a significant impact, not a negative one, not a positive one. That work is still in progress. I think the report of that group will be coming sometime in early 2022, and Commission's decision on that one is then subsequent to that report. But yes, so I acknowledge that there is this lack of those intermediate definitions, but that's also because they were not necessarily even meant to be part of this first one, which is just the greenest of the green. And yes, it is narrow, but also, I mean, all of us platform members, Commission, everybody trying to say from the beginning, and this is not meaning that everything else which is outside this is bad. It just means that you don't have a significant positive contribution. That's all. So you may be totally neutral. You are not here, not there, or then you may be very brown. But all of that, all of the rest is in the same basket currently. Only the greenest of the green is in the taxonomy. So it was not even meant to put activities, industries, corporates, anybody in two different baskets. It's one basket which is for the best, and then there's another basket which needs to be looked into still. if I speak sort of in everyday language. So yes, I do recognize the problems, the issues that Martin mentioned, and this is just work in progress. And of course, it's extremely time-consuming and a very labor-intensive work, and plenty of people are working at it. But it is what it is, basically.
Yes, well, as you say, very much work in progress.
Yes.
I think the key word there was significant.
Yes, exactly.
Contribution. So I think that's the thing. If I could just stay with you for a moment, Eila. Exclusions. Some of the things that have been excluded, say from the ratios that are calculated. What effect does that have?
Are you talking about the green asset ratio or green investment ratio?
Yeah.
Well, we would have recommended a bit differently to make this ratio as inclusive as possible.
Okay.
It has been decided otherwise for a number of reasons, which need to be worked upon. Because of course, in for something like EIB, we have a target that by 2025 we will do half of our lending in climate and in other environmental projects. Now, if we look at this green asset ratio, even for us, well, we will not be, our green asset ratio would not be anywhere close to that 50% with these definitions. But there is a revision intended, and from our side, we would push for that revision as early as possible, because now it just takes out all the public sector, well, not municipalities, but public sector like governments and SSAs, who are a very big part, for example, of the green bond market. It takes out trading assets for banks, it takes out SMEs, etc., etc. So we will probably go and recommend some kind of, from the platform, some kind of voluntary disclosures in addition to the mandatory disclosures. But one also needs to see that the voluntary disclosures would be as uniform as possible, because otherwise you just get something which is not comparable, and that's not in anybody's interest. We need that comparability. So I think there is some work to do there, and I think rather sooner than later as well, in order to get this on the right track. Because if your ratios for an investor, for a bank, are too small, if you show 2% taxonomy alignment, well, even if you double it, you're going to about 4. And then I could say, well, who cares? It's just neither here nor there. So you need to be looking at things from the widest possible angle. What is your real green engagement, and not a small subset of it? So I think this work is quite urgent.
Absolutely, and I think your point about numbers, disclosures being real and being comparable is a very important one. Martin, I mean, alongside comparability, I mean, there really needs to be clarity, doesn't there, and transparency. And one of the things that I hear from people is that there just isn't enough of that yet. What's your view on the amount of clarity that there is and how much more is needed?
I think a lot more clarity is needed, right? The process that has been put in place, and I respect and I actually value the time pressure and the way that the EU has tried to drive this forward. But we're now in the awkward situation that corporates don't disclose in the way that we as asset managers, or even our wealth management franchise, would need to be able to communicate to our clients on these metrics. So currently, we don't have the capital expenditures, we don't have the revenue sources of the green taxonomy available when we invest in these companies. And the companies themselves don't even have it. After that, we take these numbers, which I already mentioned are relatively low, and go to our clients, put it on a fact sheet, and say the percentage of sustainable investments of this product is 6%, because that's all we can say credibly verify and put on a fact sheet. That doesn't help this discussion that I mentioned before about language. People don't see okay, so they've taken the strongest view, it's only a small part of the, they think sustainable investments 4%, 6%, 94% is not sustainable. And they're trying to sell me a product that apparently takes this into account. I don't believe them. And that's why we get all these discussions around greenwashing, about asset managers trying to where the asset managers are trying to do their utmost best to make sure that they're aligned with the current standards of reporting and the requirements that are out there. And I think this mismatch we need to work on very hard, because it will drive a wedge between the willingness of the investors, and we feel it every day, institutional, retail investors. Everybody is looking to find ways to allocate more to green investment opportunities, but it's very difficult to disclose that you're actually doing what they expect in the current setup.
Yes, well, in some ways, it sounds as if by trying to do the right thing and communicate as much as you can to investors, you end up inadvertently putting them off or making them suspicious. Elizabeth, is this something that you're concerned about, or do you think this is just a necessary part of the process of getting to greater understanding? We'll get more disclosure, and we'll get those percentages up.
No, I definitely agree that it's a major area of concern, particularly when we're talking to retail investors. I think the institutional market, will have greater capacity to understand what the taxonomy numbers are telling them, and will hopefully understand the context in which those numbers are communicated. But I think particularly when we're talking to a retail market, we did some consumer research earlier this year, and we found that only 11% of the people we polled even understood the acronym ESG. So when we start getting into, what does a sustainable investment mean? Not the plain language English version of sustainable investments that an investor reading a sustainable fund might think of, but this very technical regulatory definition, or what does taxonomy mean? And understanding that this number is actually, a very complex figure. There's 600 pages of technical legislation that underpins just climate change and how you calculate that. The platform's recent consultation on the other 4 environmental objectives was over 1,000 pages. It's very, very specific in terms of what this number's telling you, but they just won't have the capacity in trying to explain that to them of what this number's actually trying to communicate. So I think that, trying to separate the taxonomy as an investment tool for investment managers, for others to sort of be able to understand what companies are doing, how are they transitioning, are they on the right pathway, is a very valuable tool. But actually, as a communication tool to retail investors, I think there's more work that needs to be done in terms of how do we communicate with retail investors in a way that actually they can understand, and just presenting a percentage of taxonomy alignment probably isn't going to help them. And I agree with the other panelists on this. It's going to be very confusing. It excludes a lot, both in terms of asset classes. We've also got to think about geography. That we just not the data doesn't exist in the EU yet, but it will eventually, at least for larger companies. But it will never exist, for emerging markets, for example. That data is going to be lacking. And as Eila mentioned, it is meant to be the greenest of the green. So by design, it was only ever intended to cover a certain percentage of the market. But trying to explain that to an end retail investor when all they're going to see is 6%, it is a huge challenge in terms of, there's a huge amount of effort that needs to be done more generally around investor education and financial literacy when it comes to sustainable investing, before we even start getting them, attuned to some of these more regulatory determined concepts that are just probably just, that step above where the average retail investor really is in terms of being able to understand and utilize this information to make an informed decision.
Well, yes, I mean, if only 11% are grasping the concepts of ESG, then yeah, percentage taxonomy alignment is going to be yet another ask. Martijn, given the extent of this challenge to communicate what the green taxonomy is about and why it is being put together, what would you like to see to really help end investors grasp the concept? Is there anything that you would like to see happen to improve the situation in terms of communicating with people what this is about?
I think there are 2 things. One, definitely being the corporates actually being forced, put more pressure on to make sure that they are required to deliver that data to us. I think that's the minimum, right? We as a shareholder have a right to know, but we can't just do it on our own. So there needs to be pressure from the regulatory environment to make sure that this transparency actually arises. The other element, and I think that was a good suggestion, is to maybe rethink the concept of percentage sustainable investments, just as a term, right? Sustainability is so much more than just climate for us, and we don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater by saying make
Oh, Martin, I think we've got a
index.
We have a slight audio problem. I'm not quite hearing you super clearly. Oh, do you want to try that answer just again? Because I think part of it cut out, so we didn't quite hear all of it. No, I'm not hearing Martin at the moment. We'll come back to Martin when we hopefully have his audio fixed. If I could just go back to you, Elizabeth, looking at other areas that possibly need to be addressed in terms of the taxonomy. I know that you're particularly interested in sort of assets that are transitioning to net zero. Could you just tell us a little bit about the way the sort of taxonomy treats those and what needs to be done to improve the way transitioning assets are treated?
Sure, Effie. So the current taxonomy does include this concept of transitional investments as a category. So I think Eila mentioned before, it's areas which are considered to be hard to abate sectors where there is no net zero option today. So things like steel, cement, aluminium, etc., have this. But when they've set those standards, they've really gone for the greenest of the green, the top class, which is very aspirational. So there's been some research done, for example, that shows that estimates that the EU criteria for cement, based on sort of transition to net zero, is sort of where the industry is expected to be in 2040. So it's already sort of very much at that very high end and quite far away from the industry is today. And there's also the concept, which is where there's a fully green equivalent, anything that's less green, even if it's still would be considered making an environmental contribution, it can't be included. So another example is hydrogen. There's a lot of talk around the importance of hydrogen, particularly in hard to abate sectors, as switching away from fossil fuels. And what we have today is various shades of hydrogen. So traditional grey hydrogen, which is still made with fossil fuels and is quite polluting. We then have blue hydrogen, which, although it's made with natural gas, it uses carbon capture to reduce the carbon intensity. And then we have green hydrogen, which is made with renewables. And the way the taxonomy treats that is that because green hydrogen exists, even though it's not really been deployed at scale and isn't really very commercially viable today, as a result of its existence, it means that blue hydrogen is not allowed under the framework. So I think that the question is really, and I think we've discussed before, how can we be more inclusive in the framework? How can we think about technologies which, even if they might not be net zero today, might be an important stepping stone towards that net zero? So lots of countries, the EU included, have set intermediate targets for 2030 to reduce carbon emissions by 55%. And a number of technologies that are going to be necessary to help us get there, even if they're not net zero, because some of those technologies aren't viable yet or aren't scalable or frankly don't exist. But some of those intermediate technologies are maybe being excluded today, which actually we still would want to invest in because they will help us at least get part of the way towards net zero, even if we then need to phase them out. So there's already some areas that we already see that. So for example, when we look at vehicles, the technical expert group suggested that hybrid vehicles should only be included up until 2025, and that then they would be phased out, and only zero tailpipe emissions cars would be available after that. So we think similar concepts to that could be helpful to expand. We also see other examples, for example, just generally sort of decarbonizing rather than setting a firm threshold. So in real estate, one of the examples is any building that can show that they've reduced their carbon emissions by 30%, that capex, so not the revenues, not the whole building, but just that capital expenditure can be considered green. And so we think that there's plenty of things already baked into some of the rules that actually, if you could expand them across sectors, would make that more inclusive, would help financing the transition, and would help make it clearer to investors that making the differentiating between, I guess, different shades of green. That yes, there's the greenest of the green, which is where we want to end up eventually, but there are some stepping stones that might be important on the way there. And we know that for some investors it maybe isn't as important to only be invested in the darkest green, but they might just want to be a shade better, or they might just want to be avoiding the very worst, and therefore we can hopefully try to bring in some of those different shades of green and brown to help people decide for themselves where along that spectrum they want to set the boundaries for themselves.
That's a very good point. I mean, these sort of transitional phases, these stepping stones, as you put it, I mean, they need financing as well, and there are investors who want to put their money in. So yes, perhaps some flexibility in terms of the framework for those would be good. Eila, I think you also have some thoughts on the issue of sort of assets in transition.
Yes, and also the transition, which is if green used to be a totally undefined term, I think we have passed it on now to transition, which contains everything and anything, and and this is one reason I would personally vote for having this other end of the taxonomy, the brown and intermediate ones as well, which would maybe put some clarity into this, because gas per se as a source of energy, I think the problem with it is, yes, it has substantially less emissions than coal, for example, but it's not fast enough. I mean, now investing in new energy sort of sources from fossil like gas means that we lock them in for another 20, 30, 40 years of economic life. And we don't have quite time for that. If we had done this in the 80s, 90s, that probably would have been fine. So it's a little bit like, I have a leaky rowing boat, and my solution to fix this problem is to buy a bigger bucket, not to fix the hole. So it's something, but there are also some processes and ways of using these which would be considered transitional, and which could go from the brown into that amber area. But we need those definitions, I think, quite soon, and to put some framework to this discussion, which is also not so easy to follow, even for experts, and certainly not for technical experts like I'm not technical experts. Thanks.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Just trying to follow all the colours is hard enough. Martijn, I'm pleased to hear that your connection is back online. Let's just go back to the point you were making earlier, which I think was about what you would like to see improved or done differently in order to make the green taxonomy a more powerful tool for both you and your investor clients.
Yeah, I think there are two key points. So one being the data being available from the corporates for the asset managers. Currently, the corporates are not reporting, and as mentioned before, maybe in time in Europe this can be implemented, but we would need it worldwide, right? Our investors most of the time invest worldwide, so we need that data, and we need regulatory pressure on the corporates to make sure that this is expected of them. That's one. And the second point, and I think that was well made before as well, we're trying to or seemingly get into some kind of a number fetish. What fits the taxonomy? What doesn't fit the taxonomy? Things just are not black and white. We are investors. We look at companies. We know which companies are working seriously on transitioning. We know which companies are not. And this should not become a where am I in the NACE code of MSCI to make sure that I can get cheaper finance because now I'm considered green and now I'm not. This should be about a real understanding of how the business model of these companies works towards being successful in a low carbon economy. And that we're missing a bit in the current framework with its very high level definitions, right? MSCI, and I'm sure Linda will have clearly stated that doesn't have the numbers currently available, and it becomes a weird game of are you in or are you out? And as much as we need a clear description of what it means, I fully support the idea that transition should be much clearer described as well. We also need the flexibility to let the people that do the investments do their work. It's in their own interest. Our investors know that they need to invest in companies that will have a business model that is successful in the low carbon economy. And if we take away that freedom and start to decide based on a number of high-level definitions and outputs from research companies, I think we're losing part of our ability to actually allocate to those companies that are best positioned to drive the net zero ambitions we have.
Yeah, so it sounds like we need two things. We need to have freedom for companies to make the investments that they want to, but at the same time we also need a little bit of regulatory pressure to help on the disclosure and reporting side. So it's a dual approach, if you like. Just lastly, these last few minutes that we've got, Martijn has set out very clearly what he would like to see change or improve. I'm just going to give Elizabeth and Eila a chance to have their wish list. Elizabeth, first of all, if there was one thing that could make the green taxonomy better or more practical or more useful for you and your company and your clients, what would it be?
I think solving the immediate one is definitely solving the data issue. And ensuring that this is a viable framework that we can actually invest in. I think today that there's a big risk that we're going to be constrained very heavily by where we can get data, and that's going to create some of the perverse incentives that Martijn just described. And I think increasingly thinking about how it can work thinking about data in the taxonomy in a global world. We know that other jurisdictions are working on their own taxonomies. There is a project underway with the EU and China under the auspices of the international platform to develop what they're calling a common ground taxonomy. But we expect to continue to see a number of jurisdictions developing their own taxonomies, and we really need to start thinking about how we start moving towards convergence so that capital flows can move around the world, can go to where they're most needed. Because in fact, when we think about climate change and the investment challenge that presents, most of the capital investment actually isn't in Europe. It needs to be going into emerging markets, particularly in Asia Pacific. And so we need to ensure that we have a framework that allows that capital to go to where it is most needed to be deployed to address the climate challenge. And that requires a global solution to this question.
That's a very good point. Yes, it isn't just about this EU taxonomy. It's bigger than that, and we do need alignments. Just a last word from you, Eila. What would you most like to see to take this project forward and make it work?
I think I have a long wish list.
I'm sure you do. Yes, if you could pick one, I know it would be very long.
Comparing what my two fellow panelists said as well. Well, I think concretely about this taxonomy, I think there's lots of usability issues that we need to find solutions for. One of the more urgent ones are these disclosures, these ratio disclosures that we already touched upon. And personally, I would hope that also this idea of defining the other parts, so gray, amber, red or brown parts as well, so that there would be more clarity what is what, so that we are not just putting things into two baskets, good ones, green taxonomy, and bad everything else, which is not the case. And I think we need some clarity in the thinking here as well. So that's for starters. I would have a longer list, but I don't think we have time with this panel anymore to go through that.
Well, perhaps not on this panel, but I do hope we will return to this topic. I'm sure we will return to this topic before long. That is, unfortunately, all the time that we have. I hope that we have been able to convey to all of you out there why the taxonomy is important, how powerful it can be, but why there is still a great need for clarity, for transparency, for disclosure. All those words, I think, came through very strongly in this session. My thanks then to Eila, to Elizabeth, and to Martijn for their wise words. And I'll now hand back to Judith in the studio. Judith, over to you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, Vincent there and his terrific panel speakers. And yes, all those key words we just heard, such as transparency, clarity and disclosure, will be relevant for our next panel, as we will look more closely into what these disclosure regulations, such as SFRD, actually mean in practice for the financial sector. And I have the great pleasure to welcome back to the Sustainable Finance Forum yet another familiar face for our audience, my colleague Hugh Wheelan. He's not only one of the finest and best informed journalists out there in regards to sustainable finance, as co-founder and joint managing director of the dedicated platform Responsible Investor, he's also in the business of getting the information out there, what ESG means and then some. So warm welcome back to you, Hugh, and to your panel. Over to you.
Great, thanks for that wonderful intro, Judith. It's nice to be here today, and we are going to be carrying on the discussion around the hugely important topic of disclosure regulations and their impacts on companies, investors, practitioners in the financial markets. As Judith mentioned, my name is Hugh Wheelan. I'm the co-founder and joint managing director of Responsible Investor. And just some very quick context on this panel. We know what the science is, of course, around climate change, and we have politicians that are going to be arriving in Glasgow probably around about now for COP26, where we're going to be getting the further policy discussion around what's required to start meeting those targets pragmatically. And we also know what the changing economics of climate change is. Anyone who tuned in recently to the IEA report will have seen the changing face of economics around the climate change topic. But we are going to be dropping deep into the topic of what disclosure regulations mean for those practitioners in the financial markets. And of course, that's a hugely important part of that whole discussion. And I'm here with a great set of speakers to start drilling down into that. For reasons of time, I'm just going to introduce our speakers by job title only, and they can develop their bios as part of their remarks, and then we'll get into some Q&A with them. It's a great pleasure to have those speakers here with us. I'm going to intro them, as I said. We have Eva Jackson here with us, Director of Sustainable Investing at BlackRock. Great to have Eva here. We also have Dr. Kalpana Seethepalli, Director of ESG for Asia Pacific at Deutsche Bank. Great to have Kalpana here as well. And our third speaker who is in the studio is Kalin Anev Janse, Chief Financial Officer at the European Stability Mechanism. Great to have Kalin in the studio with us. We are going to start, though, with Eva, and I'd like Eva to talk to us about just sort of take a step back to the MIFID disclosure regulations. and then talk to us about how they start to dovetail with what we're seeing under SFDR, so the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations. Eva, over to you. I'll leave it there for the moment, and we'll sort of pick up and clarify as we go. Great to have you here. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Hugh, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. So SFDR and Taxonomy introduced disclosure regulations for financial products. So what this means for investors is that there'll be a new set of detailed information on sustainability-related characteristics of financial products. So that's a lot more information, a lot more useful information to inform investment decision and investment decision-making processes, to enable investors to really make better decisions for clients. So what Mifid does and how that with SFDR and is it provides a mechanism by which institute financial market participants, and by that I mean managers, I mean managers, I mean insurers, it provides a mechanism that it provides a requirement for end investor suitability to be assessed with regard to end investor sustainability preferences. And that's quite fundamental, because what that means is that those end investor sustainability preferences will then be matched to products that have sustainable objectives and characteristics to match with sustainability. So it's quite a fundamental change for the industry. And we give an example retail is that LDR, the sustainable preferences are. They may say it's global warming and looking to mitigate climate change, for example, climate change and mitigate global warming. They may say it's better access to education. And those will then be matched with products which have those objectives and have sustainability characteristics, which meet the preference which the retail client has expressed. And there's a lot of work underway in the industry by asset managers, by wealth managers alike, to think through and to translate that legal definition of sustainability preferences under MiFID into a way that it's understandable for end investors, and it's a way that it's workable to actually match those sustainability preferences expressed with financial products. So, we think that this will be a fundamental change for the industry. We think that sustainability preferences now being factored in to end user it will be implications across the management value chain. So from portfolio reporting, from portfolio management, through to product design. And it will increase transparency. And we all know transparency is really key. I know that Kalin just about taxonomy, very much around transparency, disclosure, comparability. So this increase in transparency, which will be provided by MiFID, will once again allow it will create increase growth investing, which we know is really key to meet those SDGs and meet those net zero targets in 2015.
Okay, thanks for that, Eva. We're having a little bit of trouble with some sound lag, but we'll keep on going because I can hear you okay. So just talk to us about how MiFID dovetails with SFDR. I mean, obviously we've heard a huge amount about the way that investment managers are having to disclose information to the market. We heard it in the last panel. Talk to us about how those two work together and where we're at in the whole process of that disclosure regulation under SFDR.
Yeah, absolutely. So SFDR, it's really proved to be a catalyst for the asset management industry. And if we think about what SFDR actually does, the SFDR and in time the taxonomy as well, it's providing further information about sustainability characteristics of financial products. And my legal and compliance colleagues are always quick to point out that it's not a tool that should be sold, that it's a disclosure framework, and it shouldn't actually be used for product classification. But I would say that what we've seen and what we've seen from clients is that they're really articulating how they think about Article 8 and Article 9 products and their longer term plans for Article 8 and Article 9 products. And so we see from a client perspective that clients are starting to prioritize those Article 8 and Article 9 products. And indeed, we've conducted a representative study across a number of clients across Europe, and we saw that the majority have actually signaled that where there are Article 8 and Article 9 products, they'll choose those products rather than the Article 6 alternative if there is an option to choose those Article 8 and Article 9 products. So the way that SFDR and Mifid fit together is SFDR provides a lot more information. So level 1 has already, it's really provided a lot more information with regard to what it consists of. And we have seen divergence across the industry of what is under level 1. But you need to start somewhere, and that's already provided a great framework for clients and investors alike to really think through what that is, and is that product really what it says it's going to be. So the way this fits together is additional information that we have under SFDR will then provide that underlying basis and data, which will enable that suitability preference assessment from the.
Ava, we're going to leave it there for the moment while we just try and fix the sound a little bit at your end. We'll come back to some of the questions that we wanted to run through on the taxonomy and its credibility within SFDR, asset management reporting on products. Let's go over at the moment to Kalpana. Kalpana, I really wanted to ask you to sort of broaden out that conversation into Asia. As to how the whole ESG discussion, which is obviously a relatively earlier stage, is starting to play out in Asian markets. Of course, that's a hugely heterogeneous set of markets there, but give us a sense of where we're at in terms of how you're seeing the ES components of ESG kind of starting to be taken up by investors in Asia, and what it means for you as a financial institution operating in those markets.
Sure. Thank you very much, Hugh. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me begin by setting the larger context of ESG in Asia. So over the last couple of decades, Asia has achieved significant growth, but at significant cost to its environment and the social fabric. And countries are now trying to correct that. Also, there is stakeholder pressure building within Asia. So certainly in multinationals from Europe and North America are building or creating demands on Asia through their supply chains. And at the same time, there are stakeholder pressures building from within Asia through the high net worth market and the focus on impact investing. So given this backdrop, there are a couple of very interesting dynamics that are playing out in the E and the S sides of the equation. On the environmental side, APAC is the largest renewable energy market in the world, with more than 55% of capex, renewable energy capex, amounting to more than $700 billion projected over the next 3 to 5 years. Yet, at this point in time, right now, the region remains dependent on fossil fuels. So still a lot of coal and oil happening in the region. So this is what makes it a very timely issue, and Asia becoming a very prime laboratory for transition from the more fossil fuel dependent industries into pivoting to low carbon pathways. On the social side, APAC is the manufacturing hub of the world. And what that means is that it connects very deep into global supply chains, and issues like worker health and safety and retooling of the labor of workers across industries to keep them relevant to emerging more sustainable business models becomes very important. So these are a couple of very key concerns. And so at Deutsche Bank, what we are doing is we are taking a proactive approach to embed ESG into our client operations. And we have a couple of key priorities given the stage, as I just laid it out for you. On the environment side, transition finance is a very key priority. And so we work with clients to help them pivot towards low carbon pathways, and also to make sure that that transition is a just transition, or you're mitigating the negative social impacts, on worker safety and workers in general. A lot of workers being out of jobs now as industries move or companies move away from the more fossil fuel based to the cleaner energy sources, for example. So a lot of our time is spent on building KPIs, crafting credible, material, and quantifiable KPIs, because we believe that greenwashing is a huge issue, And we see that evidence-based, data-intensive sort of ESG will be critical to combating the combating the greenwashing problem.
Kalpana, are you seeing the translation of disclosure and regulation out of Europe and some sort of clearer signs in the US of take-up actually translating into Asia? And are participants in the market starting to ask you what it's going to mean for them? Are they looking at CapEx decisions as a result? How are you seeing this kind of the translation of what's happening in Europe and beyond into Asia on a kind of on an adoption basis?
So a lot of our clients are interested in pivoting to more sustainable business models. There is a huge dearth in the market to advise them to take the right steps. So in this context, disclosure has become a key tool, but the key focus on regulation right now should be to protect the market against greenwashing. And I mean, if investors and stakeholders perceive that more real impact is happening on the ground than is actually happening, then that's a problem. And disclosures need to address that. So right now, companies are disclosing something, disclosing anything to check the box, but that needs to be stopped. And so in our view, really, and that's what we do on a daily basis, that regulation should not just push, but guide companies to basically help them disclose the right kind of metrics that give a more clear picture of their own transition to sustainable business models to the market and to key stakeholders. And from Deutsche Bank, that's what we do on a daily basis. That's why the focus on KPIs that are credible, measurable, quantifiable, and that then chart out a company's progress towards sustainability.
Yeah. And do you get a sense that the regulators in different markets are starting to evolve their approach to accompany financial actors who are obviously operating internationally? Entities like Deutsche Bank are doing certain things in Europe and trying to sort of match up what they're doing in their business internationally. Are you getting that kind of pragmatic accompaniment from governments and regulators across Asia? I know it's a broad question, but are you seeing good practice starting to come through?
So yes, a very good question, Hugh. And so a couple of things that are playing out, and there's a lot of heterogeneity in the market as well. So companies, as well as financial institutions and their advisors, what have you, they may sometimes take a pragmatic approach, and I use pragmatic in a careful context here. Sometimes they could match the company's activities or KPIs to regulatory principles, which in some countries are lower than the EU gold standard. But from Deutsche Bank, what we try to do is we have a very uniform, standardized framework that we use. It's called the Sustainability Finance Framework, and that is very closely tied to the EU taxonomy. So regardless of which company we operate in, which region we operate in, we make sure all our ESG compliant investments are indeed in line with our sustainable finance framework. So we, in a way, raise the bar of whichever country we are operating in. And secondly, we also, and I personally, sit on a couple of APAC region-wide regulatory. So we work with regulators here, and our emphasis is to be pragmatic. And here I use pragmatic in a more positive way. Is that we have to be pragmatic to facilitate capital flows in and out of the region. So we can't create a regulation here which is at complete odds or is orthogonal to what is happening globally. So once again, we try to keep it aligned with the gold standard of the EU taxonomy, knowing that there are practical issues with it and the applicability of it across industries, which is what speakers in the previous panel spoke on. But yes, we do use pragmatism to raise the standards across the countries we operate in to a globally recognized common language and vocabulary. And in this regard, specificity is very important. So I would underscore here, like I underscore with my clients on a daily basis, specific ways, methodologies, targets, metrics, disclosure frameworks, SASB, TCFD, these are the tools. So you have the taxonomy, which creates a certain standard, but how to get there, we think that specific disclosures like SASB and TCFD are critical to actually reach that standard.
Great, thanks for that, Kalpana. We're going to bring in Kalin in the studio, and we'll come back to some of those points you raised with Eva shortly. But Kalin, the European Stability Mechanism has an interesting role as an investor, an issuer, and you've also been one of the key institutions involved in developing the EU taxonomy, which we'll come back to again. But talk to us about what that taxonomy work is starting to mean globally, in your view, as someone who's been on the inside of its development.
Thanks, Hugh. And let me start off by saying that this event could not have been more topical to hold it this month, because a lot of change happened. Last week, we speak about ESG, but last week the market crossed the $2 trillion mark. It was only in 11 months that we moved from 1 trillion to 2 trillion. It took us 13 years to go from 0 to 1 trillion. So you see that this market is really developing. Secondly, what's interesting, almost 60% of this market is in Europe. So the issuers come from the European region and only 17% from North America. And APAC is around 20%. And if you look at the dominant currency, it is the euro. So it means that for Europe, we are not only leading, but it also comes with a responsibility. As this market is so big globally, we need to take a leadership role in this space. And if you look at the EU taxonomy, for me, this is the first global regulation that happens in this market. Before that, it was best practices, some labeling. We spoke in this panel, but also in the previous panels about greenwashing, which is something that I personally am very concerned about. But the moment you start regulating this very deeply, you're certain as an investor that if you buy something that's green and it has a green label, that you buy what you really expect. It's like going to a supermarket. If you have something that says organic and has the EU label on it, you know it's organic food. That's the area we are trying to develop this EU taxonomy. More importantly, this is also democratically carried. The EU taxonomy went to the European Parliament beginning of this month. So it means that 400 million people are represented in this democratic discussion in getting this taxonomy right. Now, this is great for Europe, but climate change, green issues are a global problem. And what I'm mainly interested in is how do you export this EU taxonomy on a global level? And earlier this year, we published a piece together with an American professor, Anna Bradford at Columbia University, that the Brussels effect, as she describes it, basically sets the gold standards, as Kalpana mentioned it, for global regulation. So I do see the EU taxonomy at the end becoming the gold standard that everyone around the world wants to comply with. If you want to play in ESG market, you have to comply with it.
Kalin, just talk to us about that point that you raised earlier about retail investors. We heard this in the panel before. Do you think we will arrive at a state where investors or end investors can actually trust what they're buying, and it will have credibility for clients?
That is, of course, the end goal, right? So if I look at myself and I go to my bank and I select how I want to invest my money, I can now select funds that have an ESG label. Now, the question is, what is underlying that? And you want to be certain that what you buy is ESG. In the future, I would expect from my bank or my broker that it has the EU taxonomy label. So a bit like you expect if you go to a supermarket in Europe, that the organic label you only get if you comply with certain regulations, the pesticides that go into it, the way the plants are treated, etc. So that regulation is, I think, very important, and I think at the end it will trickle down to the end consumer. More to add, I think, is that the consumer is demanding it. Every time I meet, whether it's university students or people that are engaged in this topic, they see this as the most important thing for the future. So we cannot get away with it or getting it right.
Thanks for that, Kalin. Just talk to us about, I mentioned earlier that you're obviously an investor in the market and also an issuer, but talk to us about the implications for you as an investor on the way that you think about financing and the regulatory trustworthiness that's required for you to operate as an investor, and then a bit about you as an issuer in this market as well, and how you're looking at issuing bonds that actually contribute to transition here and to improving social issues.
Yes. Well, to start off with an investor, we have 80 billion asset under management, which are paid in by the 19 governments of the euro area. So this is our paid-in capital from the eurozone. And we signed up last year to the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investments, where we are scoring every single investment that we have on E, S, and G. So we don't look only at the E side, but also on the S and the G. And this is a heavy exercise. And as of next year, we have to report on it if you're one of the signatories of UNPRI. And what we also have done is we have actually gone up 10 times in our labeled bond investments over the last 2 years. So if you look at 2018, we invested 450 million roughly in E or S bonds, so green bonds or social bonds. Last year, it was 4.5 billion, so 10 times more. So we have basically moved large parts of the capital in use of proceeds or labeled bonds in order to help this market develop. On the issuance side, we are a large issuer in euro-denominated debt. We are part of the European pandemic response. So we have pledged 240 billion to help healthcare and pandemic costs for governments. And in order for those credit lines to be triggered, we have signed up to the social bond principles of the International Capital Markets Association. This is also verified by Sustainalytics. So once these credit lines are triggered and they're open until the end of next year, we will be issuing social bonds behind that.
Okay, great for that. Thanks for that, Kalin. Eva, let's bring you back in. Hopefully the sound will be better now. We could hear you okay before, it was a little bit patchy. Talk to us about how so we heard a bit about the taxonomy and what it's starting to mean for end investors. Talk to us about what the challenges are for asset managers in thinking about it and what it means, and what the positives are in how it's enabling financial products to be thought about, investment to be thought about. Give us a sense of sort of the two sides of the coin, so to speak, there.
Absolutely, and I hope that the sound is better now. Look, the taxonomy, look, as we've heard, it provides a clear and transparent mechanism for portfolio managers to assess how a portfolio is aligned to clear, defined, and prescriptive criteria. And we've heard a few times on this panel now about greenwashing, and protecting against greenwashing is really key. You know, we need to make sure that products are doing what they say they're going to be doing, and that clients buying products which they understand are doing what they say they're going to be doing. So there's greenwashing, its protection against greenwashing is really key. I'd say the taxonomy really provides transparency around what that product is doing. And at BlackRock, transparency is something which we really think is critical. Through the course of last year, and without regulatory impetus, we've actually placed sustainability characteristics across all of our mutual funds globally. So we've actually now reporting on the websites the sustainability characteristics across all of our mutual funds. And this year, we're actually taking that one step further, and we'll be reporting the implied temperature metric across all of our funds where that data is available. So transparency is really something which BlackRock thinks is very key, and which the EU taxonomy goes a very long way towards actually providing that transparency on portfolios. I'd say so. There's a lot of positives about it, and I'll talk a little bit about the positives from an investor perspective. From a challenging perspective, I'd say, and I think we heard some of this on the previous panel. There's probably a couple of points that I'd highlight. So firstly, it's around data. So is the lack of data, and in some cases the overabundance of data, and the need to make sure that we have robust data to really make sure that what is being reported to is of a certain quality, and it's really comparable across all products. And we think CSRD is going, and BlackRock is very supportive of CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. That's actually going to go a long way towards addressing that data challenge. But we do know, across all of our portfolio managers and across investors across the industry, we do know that data is still a big challenge to actually integrating climate risks and opportunities into a portfolio.
But what is the challenge there? It's often sort of held up as a challenge, but what is it in reality? Is it just that the data is not credible enough, is not audited enough, is not relevant enough to investment decision making? Just give us a sense of what exactly the problem is there.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say that there's been, so if we think back 4 or 5 years, the lack of data was actually a big obstacle to creating sustainable investing products. And I would say that over the course of the last few years, we've seen more and more third-party data providers providing good ESG data to investors, and to be able to really increase access to sustainability, to sustainable investing products, and to really build more and more products, increasing that accessibility. If we think about the taxonomy, so taking your question and making maybe really focusing on the taxonomy and drilling into that, the taxonomy has very prescriptive criteria. We've heard that in the previous session, and there is a lot of work underway to extend that taxonomy to cover more significantly harmful activities, and to point to future stranded assets, and to look at more green assets. But it is quite prescriptive and defined formulae and criteria that need to be reported to. So the challenge is really ensuring that data is of a robust quality, that it's comparable across all of the financial products, so that the end investor can actually use that. All asset managers will need to report to the taxonomy, so all end investors are actually going to be able to compare the reporting that's being done. I'd say from a positive perspective, and I do want to just make a few comments on the positive aspects of the taxonomy. Look, it's a tool which will enable investors to uncover value drivers in products, and I think that's key. I think we've heard a lot about the narrow scope of the taxonomy at the moment, and some of the challenges. But I think looking forward, we do think it's going to be used over time as a very broad tool by investors, and it will enable our investors to uncover the value drivers, to really drill in deep and to understand what risks need to be mitigated in portfolios. So we do think it's a very valuable tool.
Right, thanks for that, Eva. We're going to bring in Kalpana just to talk a bit about that greenwashing issue as well. The need for audits, Kalpana, is obviously crucial. We don't need to see double counting and distortion of investment flows. Talk to us a bit about what you think is required to accompany that potential problem of greenwashing, but from an audit perspective.
Sure, Hugh. I think there are audits and verifiers and arrangements of that nature which the ICMA has coded into, certainly on the bond market side. But there is one issue on ESG accounting which nobody is discussing as yet, and that is very, very critical. And what I mean by that is there is a danger that the same sustainable investment is counted multiple times. So in other words, you have different financial institutions saying that they are channeling billions of dollars into sustainable investments without necessarily having a corresponding impact on the ground, because they are basically refinancing an existing asset. So it's the same asset, underlying asset, but just have different institutions coming in, churning cash, churning money, which is fine. But for all the money that has gone into that investment, there is no corresponding additionality of impact on the ground. At other times, you could have the same underlying asset, the same investment could have better ESG outcomes because the particular financial institution is associating higher or more credible ESG metrics and KPIs with that transaction. So same underlying deal could have progressively better ESG impact, whether it's in terms of emissions reductions or any other KPI as you may have. So net, what we need, what the industry needs, Hugh, is robust ESG accounting, which tracks specific investments through the life of that investment and really saying, okay, this much money went in, but what was the corresponding additionality or corresponding impact on the ground?
Thanks for that, Kalpana. We're going to bring in Kalin to wrap us up. Kalin, I wondered if you could just give us a sense of what you think would be a couple of crucial steps that would start to internationalize the work that we've seen at the EU level credibly internationally as we head into COP26, and we've heard Eva and Kalpana give some really good examples of where there are both challenges and serious benefits starting to be applied. But Kalin, over to you too.
Well, my fear with COP26 is that it will overpromise and underdeliver. We've seen that with Kyoto, we've seen that with Paris, and there is a fear that this could happen with Glasgow as well. And I think what is, for me, the most important is to look at which parts of the world are taking the biggest leaps forward. And I think here Europe is leading the way. I hope the US will follow up on the promise. President Biden started with the climate change agenda. We have seen very little from that in real action. So for me, that would be a demand. I see Asia moving forward. If I speak to Asian investors, for them, this is a big topic and they want to really engage in it and even take the European standard as a global standard, at least as a starting point. So for me, as also the commissioner said earlier in this conference, linking the different taxonomies and going for the gold standard will be the important next step. And well, we owe that to our children, right? If I speak to my little kids and also to their friends, for them climate change is the biggest topic of their future, and we have to solve it, and it's our generation that needs to do that.
Eva, maybe in Kalpana, just to end out, how optimistic are you that internationalization of disclosure and standards here can work? Eva.
We are optimistic, actually, that the IFSR-led global efforts to globalize the standards will reach a positive outcome, and I think we have to be as well, because I think as we've had climate change is a global issue, and this will need to be solved for globally. And I think there is real awareness. You know, we've heard this from Kalpana, who sits in Asia, from myself in Europe, Kalin, who's in Luxembourg. You know, that it is a global issue, and it does need to be solved globally.
Kalpana to end.
Indeed, Hugh, I am optimistic about some positive impacts. I will underscore and emphasize that KPIs at the investment level will be critical. Those are the ones that will drive the real change, because that is when stakeholders around, investors or asset manager or just, journalists around can associate, okay, this is the impact coming out of this investment. Otherwise, in very, very macro levels, you can't really perceive what impact is happening if you only look at index level data or large, ESG data provided by large data providers and so on, but drill down, if possible, to the investment level. At the asset level, what is the impact that's being had? And then that you aggregate upwards. And I'm sure that with adequate KPIs and with reporting standards tightening, and as Kalin and Eva mentioned through their talking points as well, all bodes well, all bodes good.
Thanks for that, Kalpana. All good messages as the politicians gather in Glasgow to try and get real outcomes on the disclosure and regulatory side internationally. We promised to shine a light on disclosure and regulations. I got a bit hijacked by the light streaming through my window, so apologies on that. But thanks to you all for tuning into this session. Thanks to our great speakers, Eva, Kalin and Kalpana, and we have run out of time, so I'm going to hand back to you in the studio, Judith, for the rest of the conference. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Wheelan, and a panel of reluctant optimists, as it were, I should say. And that gives us actually the key word for our final piece for this conference, because we want to talk about impact investing and the case for impact optimism. Now, as we heard in our investment trends panel yesterday, as a result of the pandemic, investors became more aware of social injustices that also are resulting from the climate crisis. And that gave rise to, if you will, almost a migration of investors from the ESG community over to the impact investing community. And just to give you some size and scope, the operating principles for impact investing, which were just founded in 2019 and sit under the umbrella of the International Finance Corporation, has some 144 signatories in 35 countries and represents some 420 billion assets under management. But if you use a recent report of the IFC, investments of just under $2.3 trillion could be considered impact investments under a broader definition, but still that's only 2% of global assets under management. So we're talking about a niche market. That said, it's a rapidly growing niche market as more investors seek to combine environmental, social, and product impact with profitability and that's key, a long-term perspective. So how does that actually work? And is there a case for impact optimism? And what about the initiative Impact-Weighted Accounting, which, according to the words of Sir Ronald Cohen, who's considered the father of responsible investing, could reset capitalism? Well, I had the pleasure to talk about all the above with Niklas Adalberth, who's an impact investor and the founder of the Norsken Foundation, which is based in Stockholm. Some of you may know Niklas Adalberth better as one of the brains and indeed co-founder and former deputy CEO of the Swedish payment services provider Klarna, which he left some years ago. So warm welcome to you, Nicolas. Good to have you at the Sustainable Finance Forum.
Thank you very much. Excited to be here.
So Nicolas, just to put our audience into the context, this year the fintech startup Klarna you co-founded was valued at, and let me double check my numbers, $46 billion. But you quit actually in 2015 after helping to grow Klarna for 11 years. Can you tell us what happened?
Right. I believed way back that it was like a one-to-one correlation with the number of zeros on my bank account and happiness. So my goal in life was really to become wealthy for a very long time. And thanks with the luck of Klarna that we were able to start at the perfect timing, right when the Swedish e-commerce took off. And obviously also quite some hard work, we were able to succeed with that goal. And I remember it was back in 2012, I was able to sell off my first portion of shares. So I went from being in debt into having $10 million on my bank account. And I could finally realize all my dreams that I've been longing for so long time. And I went by business class for the first time. I went to Las Vegas. I went into this big panorama suite, and I went out shopping like crazy, eating expensive foods and ordering wines I couldn't pronounce. And being back in that hotel room and seeing all of these branded bags and the feeling of, wait a minute, is this really happiness? And I started to realize that I didn't sleep better in that bed compared to my IKEA bed at home. I couldn't taste the difference between that wine and my sheet bag and box at home. And I didn't look any different in those outfits. And I broke down in that hotel room, just realizing that this was clearly not a goal worth striving for. And it made no difference whatsoever to my life and to happiness. And I went into a little bit of soul searching and find out that a meaningful life is a life where you're not just thinking about yourself, but actually trying to be helpful to other people as well. And that made me actually in 2015 decide to quit at Klarna and try to pursue a life and to spend my time and wealth on something that is greater than myself. And that's probably the most egoistic thing I could do, since that really brings me happiness. And also I started to reflect on how lucky in life I've been to be born in Sweden with free healthcare, free education, I mean, if I wouldn't do something that was more meaningful, who would? And to chase then the next valuation didn't make any sense whatsoever. So all of that led up to that decision.
So fast forward, I'm sitting here looking at the Norsken website, and since 2015, you've been quite busy and together with collaborators and fantastic talent, developed something that has a triple aspect. And if I use my own words, what I see when I look at the Norsken website and these three pillars that you put together, I see a startup, a venture capital firm, and an NGO, all rolled into one. Those are the best words I can come up with. But could you please help our audience understand how this triple approach by Norsken works to do what you set out to do, impact investing?
Right, so I knew that I didn't need to make more money out of this initiative. So I put everything into a foundation, where it's totally disconnected from my personal gain, so to say. And we have different activities that we do within the foundation. So one is a high competitive market return impact fund, in which we are taking in external capital and to try to combine and prove that you can make a lot of impact meanwhile doing competitive returns. There's no contradiction. I think that if we can prove that thesis, even more capital will flow into this in this direction. And you mentioned initially the numbers of the growth of impact investing. I think that is super encouraging and it's massive, but it still comes from a quite low basis if compared to like the total landscape of everything that is being invested. And if you look at that, you realize that, I don't know, 95 or 98% is still not taking into consideration if it is net negative or net neutral, which is kind of sad. And so that's one thing that we do, but we also are doing, have a pool of capital in which we don't need to have competitive financial return, which we can take a little bit more bolder bets into initiatives that doesn't have a proper business model yet. And then we can also do pure donations from the foundation as well, where we find cases that has high impact but no business model, so to say. So that's a little bit what we do, but we're also setting up something called Norsken House, which is like WeWork, but for impact. So in downtown Stockholm, we're housing 450 impact entrepreneurs and try to give them all the support that they can get and need to have to be successful. But I think that taking one step back is that when I decided to quit Klarna, I decided that coming into something called effective altruism, that really helped me sort out that, okay, how can I be best useful? How can I get the biggest bang for the buck from an impact perspective? And since I know a little bit about entrepreneurship and technology, it made sense to use those components to try to do good. And what we want to accomplish with all the different products or vehicles we have is to make impact entrepreneurs the rock stars of tomorrow. And because I think that if that can be like the next most popular thing to do, if you're a talent out of a top university, to actually persuade with entrepreneurship and business model to actually tackle real problems and not just create another poker website or credit company or an addictive computer game. I think that will change everything.
So creating real value for the economy while solving some of those problems out there, environmental, social, governance, whatever, technical, whatever they may be. And now what comes up usually at this part of the conversation is how you monitor impact. Are there specific KPIs that stand out that Norsken uses? So how is risk taken into account and balance? And are there maybe different approaches in the three different areas? You said in one area, there's actually not such a focus on monitoring. The risk is really high because you're looking for another outcome.
No, that's correct. So if we look at the commercial impact VC that we have, for example, in that vehicle, we first look at the impact that this initiative or the company that we invest in, it needs to have a one-to-one correlation with revenue and impact. So for each unit sold, it needs to be 1 unit of that specific impact. And we're an impact agnostic fund, so it doesn't matter which SDG they're solving, at least as it is one clear social or planetarian issue that they are solving with their business model. And so for each company we invest in, we set and define an impact KPI. It could be CO2, for example. And then we measure that. We force the company to measure that. And we set a forecast, just as we have a financial forecast when we invest. And if we don't reach that specific impact KPI on that company, that is then also reflected in the team's carry. So no impact targets being hit, it will be no carry for the team. So it's really interlinked and connected all the way through.
So it's truly innovative thinking there. What I'm being reminded here is of an argument that sometimes comes, actually quite frequently comes up in discussions about whether to apply social aspects or environmental aspects at all when investing. It's been argued that fiduciary responsibility is purely about generating monetary revenue, never mind climate, biodiversity, or social issues. Probably goes back to Milton Friedman, who argued against the social responsibilities of entrepreneurs, of stakeholders, of businesses. So the argument goes for more investors to take sustainability seriously and to, for example, to use a very practical example, divest fossil fuel assets. The law would need to be changed and fiduciary responsibility directly tied in with sustainability aspects. What do you think about that argument? Or rather, what is your counter argument as impact investor?
No, it was Milton Friedman, as you said, I think, and I think it was somewhere around the 70s when he quoted that. And I think that was quite understandable given how the world looked back then. And it was the same for me when I did Klarna. It felt so good because the miracle pill to the world was economic growth. As long as you have economic growth, that will solve everything. And I think that is true to some extent, and it's still true. I mean, thanks to economic growth, we have like 1 billion people being taken out of poverty from China and India. So it is really good. But I think now looking at it in 2021, we also see that economic growth comes with some clear negative externalities. I mean, we are destroying the planet with this economic growth since it's not sustainable. I mean, we already now need 4 globes if everyone would live as a Swede. I mean, not sustainable, and it's clear net negative on so many different externalities. And we do have the eyes on CO2, I think, but I mean, it's just so many other collapse scenarios if we just continue to extrapolate this curve the way it is right now. And it could be like biodiversity, we see collapses of fish ecosystems, lack of pollinators. I mean, the list is just so long, and it doesn't look very, very promising. So I think that going back to your question a little bit, that can we continue to just look at shareholder value? Perhaps. I mean, if the regulators are able to keep up, which they are, they clearly see now that this cannot go on. We need to price negative externalities in a way that we haven't done before. It cannot and should not be as cheap to destroy the environment for a company. And if we get that in, and I think the investors are starting to realize that this will be reflected in, for example, an oil company's profit, that it will be taxed the way you destroy the environment. And given that future short-term scenario, I think it's clever for everyone to actually support the different stakeholders and not be negative.
So tagging onto that, the title for our conversation today is the case for impact optimism. Given the scenario you just painted, where does your impact optimism come from? Do you have maybe an example coming out of the Impact Accelerator, the Norsken Impact Accelerator, which is of course based in Stockholm? A favorite example of a startup that came through this process that really shows and makes the case for impact optimism?
Right. So yes, we do this Impact Accelerator together with UNDP. So we got over 2,000 startups applying, and we were able to select the 20 most promising ones. And one of those examples could be, for example, SemVision. They are now enabling I don't know if it's the world's first, but the world's first commercially industrialized CO2-free cement. And cement is a big portion of the CO2s in the world. And if they're able to crack this, it will have a very big impact. And we've been able to support them now in this accelerator this summer, which is really fun. And the other 19 startups, they're also like totally amazing in terms of what issues they are solving. And regarding my optimism, I must say that I once per year do lectures at the Stockholm School of Economics in Stockholm. It's the most prestigious business school in the Nordics. And I usually ask the students question like how many could consider going into not only entrepreneurship, but impact entrepreneurship. And 4 years ago, no one knew about this term. And today, almost all students raise their hands that they don't want to use their talent and to just go in to start any other business as it was 5 years ago, but they actually want to use their talent to actually start a meaningful business, an impact startup. And I think this will go more and more viral across the globe, that the talent of tomorrow, it will not work for a net negative company. They actually want to use their skills and be financially wealthy with their startup, meanwhile solving a societal issue.
Yes, that mirrors development elsewhere, whether in election outcomes or in requests to asset managers by wealthy young investors who want to put their money to good use while also generating a good return on investment. So a little while ago, you mentioned regulation. Of course, we've covered that extensively over the course of this fourth Sustainable Finance Investment Forum. The EU's regulatory sustainable finance innovation, including the taxonomy and various disclosure requirements, have already galvanized the interest of investors and also promoted policy action elsewhere in the world, in different countries, also across Europe. How helpful do you find this incoming regulation, specifically for your work as impact investor?
Right, so I don't know it at heart, but I think that, everything that brings more transparency and makes it easier for investors in what to invest in and what kind of impact that would have, I think that should be welcomed. And I think that the taxonomy, as it looks right now, is like very promising. So I think that's something that I dearly support and think it will going to be hopefully spread outside the EU as well.
And linked with that are also various initiatives to bring more transparency, more evolution to data analysis, and help investors understand what it is, what sort of impact it is they're putting their money in while they seek this double return. And you, or rather the Norsken Foundation, is collaborating with the Harvard Business School on something known as impact-weighted accounting. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Why this data analysis is so helpful from your perspective, and how you got to this collaboration? And does it truly have the potential to reset capitalism as it's been held?
Well, I guess the jury is still out there, and I've seen so many different impact measurement and impact reporting models, and I think they're all good. They all bring something to the table, but it wasn't until I saw an impact-weighted accounting initiative by Harvard and Sir Ronald Cohen and other people that were involved in it that I was truly impressed. And I think that if you look at current impact reports, they're most of the time hidden way behind, way low down in a free text kind of manner in the different reportings. And I doubt how many that actually reads it. And I think that the reason behind that is because there's so much subjectivity around it. But if you can translate a company's impact into actual numbers, I think that changes everything. So that this becomes clear and comparable. What's the difference between Coca-Cola and Pepsi, for example, in terms of the damage or the positive they do for environment and for the people and planet? I think, to me at least, that is the end result that needs to happen. Because if you get a number of the externalities of a specific organization, then eventually you can tax it. and it will be super clear of the talent on which company you want to work for. And yeah, so we are very proud, not backers, but we do have like a small impact weighted accounting initiative that we've done in Sweden, in which we rank the top 100 biggest companies. And we really looked into what were their contribution in terms of money, of the negative or positive they had on people and planet.
Yes, it's actually quite fascinating. So you just Google Norrsken and then I think the list or impact weighted list, and you see the top 100 Sweden's largest public companies according to their environmental impact. And I think you're going to expand it to social and product impact. Are you going to take this further, maybe expand it to more companies across Europe?
Eventually, we hope to do that, yes. But as you said, next step will be to add the other two dimensions as well. Now we only done environment, and now we will add social and product as well. But the model is still in a beta mode. It needs to be developed further, but I think it created a lot of healthy conversations in Sweden when we published this list. It was quite a lot of exposure and quite a lot of companies interacting with the numbers and yeah, had some opinions on it. And the model is not perfect, but I think it's really, really good, at least from a not perfect, but from a wider conversation to have.
Yeah, bring more transparency and shed some light on these different aspects. And I should add that if you just Google impact weighted accounts Harvard Business School, on their website, you can actually see the results of some 1,800 companies of their true environmental cost, and that's going to also be expanded to product impact. And I've already seen online there's sectors including airlines and consumer finance, consumer packaged food, oil, gas, and so forth. And they're also going to expand it to social impact. So it's a work in progress, definitely. And what comes to mind here is we're talking now about these huge, large, mostly publicly listed companies, but so many companies in Europe are actually small and medium-sized enterprises. Do you think the model can be adjusted to also take account of their true cost and impact?
Yeah, perhaps, if it's made simple enough. I think that if you're a startup, at least my experience starting Klarna, I mean, you have so much work to do, and you're not thousands of people to start with. So every piece of regulation or thing that you have to do is like a big burden. So I think that if the model is going to be developed and hopefully come into legislation one day, it should be like different thresholds on how big you need to be and what kind of framework you need to comply with.
Definitely so. As I said, work in progress. Now, let's circle around back to what you mentioned earlier, the Norsken House, I hope I pronounced that correctly, in Stockholm, is considered, I understand, Europe's biggest hub for impact and tech entrepreneurs, with some 450 members, 150 startups. But Stockholm isn't the only location where you're setting up a Norsken House. Another location is Kigali in Rwanda in East Africa. Can you tell us more about why there, and what are the further plans for the Kigali Norsken House?
Right. So, I mean, we've been quite active in Europe when it comes to trying to put the spotlight on impact entrepreneurs, but spending some time in Africa as well, you realize that a lot of the challenges we have in the West or in Europe is still fades to what there is in Africa. So we do want to be contributors in entrepreneurship in that area as well. So as you said, we're setting up this quite big hub in Kigali. I think it will be East Africa's biggest hub for entrepreneurship. And that would we try to do as a way of creating jobs, sustainable jobs. Because in the end, I mean, I think that's the biggest impact area in this region. And if we can be putting the spotlight on like normal entrepreneurship as a way of create jobs, I think that could have a big impact. But on the side of this as well, we are also now looking into a big growth fund for Africa entrepreneurs, because it also looked very promising if you look at the demographics. I mean, 1.2 billion people in Africa. I think if it's like 80% are still below 25 years old. And most of them now have a smartphone, and they're surpassing and bypassing the old traditional way of doing banking and logistics and healthcare, going directly to some extent into telemedicine. I think this cohort of people will change everything for this continent. And I think it's a very big business opportunity to be done in Africa. And I think and hope with this fund and everything else that is happening down there, that the next unicorns and the ones after that will come from Africa.
I think there may be some in the audience who would fully agree with you and also have cottoned on to this opportunity in Africa for good reason. Now, circling back to the beginning, my first question, what happened in 2015, knowing what you know now and having gone through this huge process of evolution and being part of a new enterprise that has gone in so many fruitful ways and is flowering and has brought in more collaborators and avenues to explore and combine your idea of doing both good and also creating business opportunities. Is there something you would do differently knowing what you know now?
There's a lot of things. I think, I mean, we're trying to create these ecosystems for impact entrepreneurship and impact investing, and it's hard to scale. I think this will not be successful if we cannot inspire other people to try to pursue this at the same, not the same way, but a similar way in their own hometown. So what we've done at the Norsken Foundation is we put in everything, all strategy documents, all kind of documentation we put up online for everyone to be inspired by, so that we could get more copycats. So hopefully it's other entrepreneurs that have been lucky as me and that might want to pursue this for their hometown. That's one thing that we're trying to encourage. And what else? I think coming into this might have been too naive in terms of that capitalism and business model will solve all societal issues. That is not the case. I mean, we still need the charities, we still need the concessionary capital as well into solving societal problems. And impact investing, making competitive returns will solve part of it, but clearly not everything. So all actors are needed.
That's the perfect way to wrap this up. Thank you so much, Niklas, Adalberth, for your time. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, this was, of course, a very inspiring interview for which I thank both Judith and Nicolas. And in particular, I would love that Nicolas' story gets many of the impact entrepreneurs going into this field. It's also a very nice way of capping these 2 days of very intense and fascinating discussions that we have had around the topic of sustainable finance. The main lessons, where are we? I think it has become very, very clear that yes, progress is being made, but is probably being made too slow. As we hear from the United Nations just days before the COP26 in Glasgow, if we continue on this pace, we will not only not reach the 1.5 degrees target, but we will probably exceed the 2 degrees target. That is something that for many parts of the world is an existential threat. So if we want to reach our targets, we really need to take up speed in the uptake of ESG in our financial systems. We've heard many voices about this. How do we go around that? Or how do we achieve this goal, rather? I think there are many different ways we can do it. We've heard the last one, Niklas, talk about impact entrepreneurship, with impact-weighted accounts. We've heard other speakers, such as Julie Becker, talk about sustainability-linked bonds. We've heard many other ideas. I think it would be unfair for all of them to try to list all of them because it's quite long. Now, what we also hear is that of course, Europe, and within Europe, Luxembourg is a pioneer and a leader in the segment of sustainable finance, where, of course, all of us, especially here in Luxembourg, but within the European Union, right to be proud of this. But as we all know, the world of finance is a globalized world. And if we want, like some speakers have said, make sure that capital can flow to where it is most needed, in particular to ensure a recovery from the current pandemic and build forward better, then we also need to not only make sure that capital can flow, but that we're actually speaking, if not the same language, a language we can all understand. And that is where I think a lot of efforts have to go into what the Commissioner has called a common ground taxonomy. Now, Europe has taken a more top-down regulatory approach. Other very important markets take more a bottom-up market approach. Whoever is right, I think we will have to see. But I think that, as Kalin said in the last panel, there's a very good chance that Europe's regulatory standard setting will ultimately prove to be the gold standard. Because if investors, if product producers, anybody selling a financial product or service wants to convince investors to invest in it, well, probably the market will impose the EU standards as such, if not in a formal way through a multilateral instrument, then at least in an informal way. And, as Kalin also said, probably the investor himself, whether retail or institutional, will want to see that this product conforms to such standards by having a label on the tin, proving that what it says on the tin is also what it contains. Ladies and gentlemen, let me invite you to check on this next year at the next edition of the Luxembourg Sustainable Finance Forum, because what we need to do is now get down to work. We have clearly seen that we need to accelerate the pace of transitioning towards a sustainable world. With this, let me also thank you as the audience for joining us on these 2 mornings here in Luxembourg and afternoons or evenings in other places of the world from where you join us. Let me thank in particular the moderators and the speakers for the extraordinary wealth of lessons that they have been able to share with us. And then let me thank again our very loyal moderator, Judith Bogner. She has this year again, with her great professionalism and her passion, led us through these 2 days in a way that helped us make most of this. For that, thank you very much. Ultimately, last but not least, let me thank our sponsors who have supported us for this event, but also our media partner, the Financial Times, for their support in making this possible. To you out there, stay safe and see you soon. Thank you very much.